Freeport is being established, I thought it was the ideal topic for a talk. Just to introduce myself, I'm an expert in politics and public policy. I've looked a lot at trade policy over the year, mostly on the larger scale, like international trade policy, UK and EU and so forth. But then the Freeport came to Plymouth, and I said, well, I have to look into this and try and understand exactly what's happening and what the likely result is. So for almost a year now, with Nicola Harmer, who's a human geographer in another school at the University of Plymouth, we've been researching this, mostly just looking at the documents of different types, and then beginning to talk to people involved. We're still mostly outsiders, I suppose you'd call it, educated, hopefully outsiders. So I will say today I will finish with quite a few questions, because I think I'm open about that, and it's, as you'll be aware, it's quite a volatile situation in general in this country. So I think almost everyone involved in this project has quite a few questions, but I will offer some conclusions as well. So I think I'll leave people with at least a better class of confusion and avoid falling off this thing. I'll be happy. I should say these conclusions are very much mine rather than Nicola's. They're very much my opinions. I might have different ones. Not sure why that's happening. Thanks. So what are Freeports, first of all? I don't know how you get rid of this. Oh, just did it again. In a nutshell, there's Freeports, there's special economic zones, enterprise zones, foreign trade zones in the US, you might have heard of. Some kind of part of a country, of a national territory that's a space apart. It's got different rules, regulations, normally fewer rules. It's got some tax breaks, or in the case of Freeports, specifically to do with customs and so on. There are now over actually 5,000 of these in the world, and there are types of arrangements in the UK already. Of course, there are enterprise zones. There are 48 of those in the UK, one in Plymouth, one in Exeter. And there were Freeports in the UK before as well, so it's not entirely new. But each one is different. Examples, well, not that far where I come from, in Ireland in the late 1950s, in the west of Ireland, which was then one of the least developed parts of one of the least developed countries in Western Europe. There was an airport, but not a great deal else, and they came up with something called the Shannon Free Zone. And this became highly significant when Xi Jinping visited Ireland in 2012, just before he became Premier of China. He visited there, as many other Chinese leaders have done, because they copied some of this on a slightly larger scale, as you can imagine. What it was they came with the idea, well, we'll offer certain tax breaks or relief on VAT and so on to companies who want to come here and re-export, and that's some kind of free zone idea. Goes way back, but this is often seen as the beginning of the modern type of region. In the US, they're also popular, called foreign trade zones. These are mostly for importation into the US market. This was the inspiration for Rishi Sunak, some of you might remember, who was the main proponent of the modern, of this current wave of Freeports back in 2016. In this case, they tend to import a lot of materials and make it into a finished product. And then when they enter the US properly, they pay tariffs, but that works out cheaper than paying on each component part. That's, in this case, that's the idea, basic idea of it. More broad idea, of course, in the world we've lived in, certainly since the past 40, 50 years, it's all about attracting investment. It's countries competing to host companies rather than vice versa. And these are a part of that, getting involved in international trade, offering different types of breaks to companies. Now, the new UK Freeports, I'll explain, are very much linked to Brexit. And in the 2019 Conservative Party manifesto, seems about 1,000 years ago, just a few years ago, they were a key part of it, and they began the process quite quickly. And Plymouth, of course, was one of the areas to get a favourable bid, which was a surprise to some, because people feel the city is often not favoured by London, by Westminster, by Whitehall, and so on. And things have moved swiftly since then, and we do now actually have a legal free port established in Plymouth, although it's not fully functional yet. A reasonable spread around the country as well. This is mostly in England. There will be some in Scotland and Wales as well. Don't know about Northern Ireland because it's complicated enough, and frankly, it wouldn't help either. Now, I think it's important to understand, when we try and make sense of the free port and what it might be and what it does, the say tempestuous kind of politics that have led to it, because what we've got is political policy made up by the Conservative Party, filtered through the civil service, I would argue made a bit more moderate probably by them, and then local areas like Plymouth that are actually reinterpreting it and trying to put their own, very much their own spin on it. Story of trade and Brexit is a complex one, and obviously it's a sore point, but I think there are some facts that are reasonably clear and that need to be understood. There were different reasons for supporting Brexit, but some in the Conservative Party were very much free traders in that. Others in the rest of the country were much more kind of protectionist and so on. However, the Conservative free traders miscalculated on two quite important points. One, they thought they could retain more market access to the EU than they could. They obviously knew it wouldn't be exactly the same, but they thought they could get a much better deal than they did. And the UK has ended up with a relatively thin deal with the EU, with its 27 neighbours. Secondly, I think they thought it was easier. I think there's some people talk as if it's a free trade world, but it never has been, for better or worse. Not actually something that believes in global free trade or something like that. Anyway, but it's never been the case. Even countries like the US that talk a lot about free trade can be quite protectionist when it's concerned and so on. What does this mean? It means Brexit doesn't mean more free trade, despite the fact that that was the deep kind of deep desire of many, at least in the Conservative Party, that wanted it. So here's on one thing that definitely could be done as a result of Brexit and could be argued to be a benefit of Brexit, even though they do have free ports in the EU. It is correct to say there are some constraints on them. You have to get the agreement of other countries and so on, and they could potentially do something more different. Although, as we'll see, then if you want to sell to the EU, it will come back and bite you as well. They used the example in Rishi Sunak's paper called the Free Ports Opportunity of Shannon in Ireland, which they said had its options and facilities reduced by being in the EU, which is true. Of course, Ireland itself has made an absolute fortune and a major trader from being in the EU. Anyway, that's the trade thing. It links with, people remember this rhetoric of global Britain, buccaneering, seafaring nation. Free ports very, very much linked with that. Now, that's not terribly logical, but that's life and politics. It's not always that logical, and that's one of the reasons free ports came to the fore. The other reason, of course, is that Boris Johnson cleverly came up with a levelling up agenda, because we realised that was one of the major impetuses behind Brexit and general discontent. Some would say the Conservative Party were an unlikely party to be leading this, but that's what he did in terms of flagging it as a policy and a goal in 2019 with great success. How free ports connect to this is very simple. That most ports happen to be relatively deprived or in relatively deprived areas, so therefore you can go, oh yeah, we'll create these global free trading entities, and we'll help in so doing so boost poorer areas areas as well. So it really pressed two very important buttons for the Conservative Party at the time. What were the aims of the Freeport? This reflects, the aims reflect these different kind of purposes. The number one priority, although it's not actually number one on the document, but is promote regeneration and job creation. I say it's about getting investment, but this is supposed to be to have a real impact. The economists call externalities of a real impact on socio-economic life, on people's living standards, regenerate old and defunct kind of areas and so on as well. And then, of course, at national hubs for global trade and investment, this kind of language as well also, and of course hotbeds for innovation, and great hope for all this for technology to change things and to allow economic growth and zero carbon and all these kind of things as well. This, and if you think about Plymouth, this actually did mean that Plymouth was in a very good position to apply, because Plymouth could argue that it did have deprived areas, rather putting, but also it does have potential and success stories. They weren't going to give it to just anywhere that happened to be poor. You would have to try and hit both of those kind of criteria: be poor, relatively deprived, but also demonstrate real kind of economic potential. Look at what the trade benefits of a Freeport are, or are supposed to be. I mean, my preliminary conclusion so far, though, I will say, is that the Plymouth Devon Freeport isn't that much about trade, from what one can tell, but we'll come back to that. And it's important to note as well, because some of this language is confusing now. No one country or one area can't create free trade, because then goods go somewhere else, and countries have a right to regulate them. You can only really create what they can allow certain things happen within their own area. One is just much simplified customs procedures, although there's also something like suspending VAT in banking accounts for companies. The potential advantage in the American case with what we call tariff inversion was that, okay, you don't pay tariffs when you arrive in this case, UK in Plymouth. You pay after you've done some work on it, and in some cases that could make it cheaper for a company. And then there's tariff duty drawback. You come in, you produce your stuff because you think Plymouth's a good place with lots of smart people or whatever it is, and then you export it, and you've never paid a tariff at all. It's just handy for companies to do. Whereas I say here, it's not clear that most of these work in the UK context. The other incentives, of course, are very important as well. Different kinds of tax incentives. And in the UK case, some money for infrastructure, not an incredible amount, but it's like 25 million, not to be sniffed at. Planning laws, something important, also controversial, and we'll talk about this, although I should have said at the beginning, I'm not an expert on planning, but it's clearly very, very important for the environment and so on. And I think in Plymouth's case, prestige and political support as well, as in, it would be logical to think at least that, okay, if we get this Freeport, well, the government isn't going to see us really go down the tank. They're going to give us support. We'll get more funds from other places, basically. It'll be a bit of a boost like that. And this is what the local people, the local council, local enterprise partnership, other local councils and that would be thinking. The tax incentives are important. Business rates relief, national insurance contributions employers have to pay normally, they wouldn't have to pay. Stamp duty, capital allowance, and some other kind of tax breaks there again, which all of this is about making this given area attractive for businesses to come. Now, criticisms of the national Freeport policy, which would go through before going to the Plymouth case, which I think is kind of unique. There's a general conclusion from economists that look at this very rigorously, look at the impact over time. What a lot of these zones tend to do, certainly in a country like the UK, at least as far as the enterprise zones, is that rather than really creating new things, they just move money around. Businesses go to this area because they'll pay a cheaper tax or have fewer regulations, but they don't necessarily. It's not necessarily the case that somebody creates a business or that somebody comes, investing from America or East Asia, or whatever like that. As I said, there's very strong evidence for this, and the UK government still works kind of transparently enough, perhaps, despite some of its members. And you can look up the Office for Budgetary Responsibility, any state body. It's in the news a lot at the moment because its calculations weren't asked for the famous fiscal event, which is a phrase that will enter, I think, the lexicon not a very positive way on September 23rd. But it itself doesn't assume any overall benefit from these reports, and they've no particular axe to grind. They're just looking at the data and the history, and they assume that it will mostly mean things move around. Of course, you might think maybe that's not bad if they're moving to here or somewhere else, but that's something to bear in mind. Other criticisms, which is my main theme today, but I think some do feel that this is just continuing like fantasy in this government about free trade, because, like I said, Britain's trade and trading position has been reduced, and this is just theoretical. You can see it in statistics as well, and that Freeports aren't the answer to that. Because the goods don't get special access to other countries necessarily at all. Also worth noting, although I don't think this is particularly fair as far in the Plymouth case or in the national government case, they're very clear about security, compliance with all these regulations. As you can imagine, whenever you have different regimes, different legal regimes in close proximity, you've all kinds of opportunities for funny business, basically crime or different types of corruption, people using these channels for the wrong reason. It's also the case by in other countries that people store art in these places because they can avoid, they can still possess it, but they can avoid paying the kind of duties that they might pay on it. This is, like I said, worth noting because it could affect a city's reputation, obviously, if that became the sense that this is what was happening. And I stress this in the case of Plymouth because local leadership in Plymouth mostly talks about Freeports like a typical kind of regional development plan, which it is for them really, but it's a bit different. There's a bit more of a twist or more of a side to it potentially. And of course, this is where for some on the right wing that the Freeports didn't go far enough. As I said, there's a policy which Sunak came up with it. Boris Johnson liked it, said, yeah, free trade, leveling up, great. And then the civil service, I think is often the case, kind of trimmed some of the edges and made it, and they put in a lot of stuff about, okay, we're not having mad deregulation, or so it became a more moderate policy. But some on the right of the 45 weren't happy with that. They wanted more radical things that we will discuss. I don't know if people have heard the phrase chartered cities, or if you're on social media, and that's definitely something to worry about. It isn't actually what the Freeports are, or whatever else they are at the moment. Try to explain that to people on Twitter. It doesn't go terribly well. The actual trade benefits are mixed. There's a great centre called UK Trade Policy Observatory, and they produce as readable as you can get on this topic. Obviously, it's a difficult enough topic, but They looked at the UK's tariff schedule, we call it, the different rate tariffs the UK charges, and tariffs are just the tax we charge on things entering the country. And they think that this tariff inversion doesn't work. For example, in the US, cars actually have a very low tariff of 2.5%, and components have more, so it makes sense to have a center to build a car in Texas or in on the coast in California or wherever. They think this doesn't actually work out in most cases in the UK's UK situation. Might look into the sectors in Plymouth. Haven't done that. It doesn't work actually, this trade benefit. And here I won't dwell too much on it, but we can talk about it in the question. Here you go into international trade agreements and trade law, and whether if something's, say, made and produced in Plymouth and exported to Canada or Japan or the EU areas where the UK has a free trade agreement with, does it qualify for those benefits? And there are quite a few. It's not simple, basically. In many cases, it won't. And also, if they think the UK is being too generous, there's a big thing in international trade law about what they call unfair subsidies. Unfair is very debatable, but if one country is, helping, giving their companies too many grants, basically, other countries will then penalise them. So basically, if the UK government says, yeah, come to Plymouth, build a solar panel, we won't pay any tariffs, and we'll even give you, a few thousand quid per panel produced, and then you can sell them to Canada. Canada will go, well, no, you can't. Well, you can, but you'll have to pay us what we see as the unfair benefit you've gotten. Hopefully that's, in principle, of that is clear enough. The details are tricky, but we can come back to it. So the trade benefits are a mix, and that's why I think it's mostly the other benefits. I will so say that Freeports are not these kind of chartered cities. The maps here are what understandably makes people nervous, but how they work is, I'm sure of this, it's only specific sites within these areas. So this isn't all a Freeport, because there's a specific site in South Yard, and I'll show you the map in Langridge and in Sherford. But people are understandably nervous, and there's understandably severe lack of trust in the government. So that's why people in the council or academics here managing the Freeport need to be aware of that. Need to be aware of very much keeping people informed and giving them a voice. So then we go on to Plymouth and South Devon. Let me just check the time. Okay, I'll keep that up. So Plymouth, as I said, was an interesting case and a strong case for a Freeport application, because, as I said, it's known as having areas of quite acute deprivation, despite the fact that, as always, you can see plenty of money in the city as well. I think, a common story of Plymouth is that it relies heavily, obviously, the public sector, particularly the defence and the naval sector. And all that's still actually relatively big, because in the 1970s it was slimmed down a lot as an employer, and that caused a lot of social problems. I think the other element of the story, again, the people here that will know this better than me, we can discuss on. In 1980s, Plymouth didn't have this kind of Thatcherite boom in services or branches of that other parts of the southern England did have, at least, whatever about the other things happen. So Plymouth was viewed as, I think, relatively left behind, and it was the centre for cities. This think tank produced a report in 2019, and Plymouth was the one southern city that they saw as having a levelling up agenda, i.e. being relatively poor, as opposed to mostly northern cities. Here I will introduce one kind of academic concept called path creation, which is about the kind of strategies of local elites, the council, enterprise partnerships with businesses, universities, and general civil leaders. Path creation is related to an older concept called path determinism, how a city or an institution, in this case, kind of gets stuck in a rut, and then when things change, it can't really change with it. A classic example of path creation was Pittsburgh in the US, which was famous for steel and heavy industry, went into a real decline in the 70s, early 80s, a lot of social problems. Then managed to kind of reinvent itself via like life sciences and universities and so on. But still, it doesn't work out equally. You know, the people damaged by the collapse of the old industries aren't necessarily those benefited from the new ones. I think Plymouth's a good example of path creation, because I think the local elites, I think quite cleverly, given the situation they were in, they went to adapt Plymouth's traditional naval kind of sector approach to sticking with the marine, obviously, but more into cultural industries, and then different types of new marine economy, including the environmental stream and so on as well. You get this with the Ocean City, which is an enterprise zone. Or no, sorry, that's Ocean's Gate. Sorry, Ocean City was the broader kind of headline tag for this, but you know, Ocean's Gate is an enterprise zone that had quite a degree of success in having these new industries and so on. And I think it's important to stress that there has been success, because there's a lesson here, but the success that we know doesn't deal with the kind of deprived areas. You know, they're not mostly the areas that can benefit from these new industries, and that's important because Freeport, I think, is more of the same, but can it somehow be steered to the benefit the poor parts of the city of community? That's the question. So they came up with this bid that, you know, very well crafted in various ways. Plymouth City Council, interestingly, it was led by Labour at the time, and very much Tory policy, but as predicted, actually, in Rishi Sunak's paper, they said you could actually see an alliance between Labour-led cities and a Conservative government offering the cities in particular these new rights, these new flexibilities. And Labour initiated this start the City Council, but they cleverly combined with other county councils, Devon County Council and South Hams. This is important because obviously the major fear of something like this is you're just going to suck in whatever was, you know, whatever we had in the surrounding area. You're just going to offer them more benefits and suck them in. So I think they did that well, and they also, you see space here, they're involving Cornwall and the space industry as well. So again, I think it was quite an enlightened, kind of broad-minded approach to it. And they came up with these 3 sites. I'm sorry about that. Visible. Not actually the main port. It's interesting, but in the South Yard area here, you're going to have a tax site where companies can get all kinds of these tax breaks. Then in Language and Sherford, on both sides of A38, you've got different types of large combined tax and customs sites. Sherford in particular, Babcock are going to be very much involved in Babcock's a major employer, which brings on to that aspect. I think it's very important to understand that the Plymouth bid and how the local council is thinking. You obviously got 2 enormously important companies in Plymouth, but these 2 are particularly important for the city. Babcock employ 7,000 Princess yachts, 3,000 total. They like this and they committed to it early on and committed to millions of investment in building new areas like Babcock and Sherford and Princess Yachts and some of the South Yard area. And one document I read was kind of just from the council just said, actually, we're anchoring these companies in the city by going with the Freeport bid. If you think of it again from the local government point of view, if you can keep these companies here for 10 or 20 years, that probably is enough in itself for them. They probably consider that a great, a good thing without any of the more, say, highfalutin global trade kind of ideas. And the two universities as well, a big role of it, University of Plymouth in particular. And Freeport itself has been established. It's going to be a limited company, essentially controlled by the three councils. In terms of what's the money needed for infrastructure development, but basically building plant. But the centre UK government is going to give 25 million. Local authority, and this is important as well, although not in the area of expertise, local authority finances, they do have to chip in as well. They're borrowing money for this, so there is quite a bit riding on it. Another central government fund levelling up, and then different types of private sector investment. So the aims are very much, as I said, when you're making these bids, you just repeat the language of what the government is saying, so that they give you the money. So they repeat a lot of that, and they say, physical regeneration, including these underused or derelict sites, infrastructure development, but very much economic regeneration and social regeneration. And they pledge, and this is, I think, a key thing for those interested in public policy of it, to avoid economic displacement. Because they say we're not going to just allow a company move, say, from Exeter to here. It's got to be something new, So that's what they say. But we'll see how it works in practice. And of course, it's very much about big environmental ambitions. And this is supposed to be contributing to the net zero idea and so on as well. A lot about innovation in more environmentally clean maritime travel and so on. That's all direct from their official what they see the employment, not enormous, but these are direct jobs, 3,500 plus. They say, they'll make sure 10% of those are filled by people that are, unwaged at the moment. Other ideas about developing land, increasing the value of land, that kind of thing, and ambitions for not an incredible amount of new businesses. If there are other people the objectives, that's what they so Nicola and I noticed doing this, we were just looking at the language from all the UK government policy documents, and then what was available from the local council reports or press releases or whatever, and we noticed again complete disconnect, some of which is obvious because it didn't make sense for local councils to be going on about Brexit and global Britain and so on. But even so, it's striking that they're very much talking about the way they talk about other things like the city deal, some will remember from a few years ago, and whatever, accessing the levelling up fund. It's about getting money, getting some stuff from the centre. And I think South Hams District Council might be more explicit, but this is the sense going on with them as well. That look, whether we like it or not, and this is true in a country like the UK, or like England certainly, everything happens at the centre really. They set the rules, they outline the game, and local governments have to play that to get money and to get access and so on. So Freeport are the thing, we've got to go for it. There's no real choice. That's obviously important though to understand how politics is working. And I also say it's an opportunity to shape national policy around our own objectives. That might be a bit kind of over the top. But I do think it's what Plymouth City Council are trying to do, basically doing what they were doing anyway, getting some more money for it and support for it. So what are the pros for this? So as you can see, I've been quite negative about the overall concept as a national development strategy. I don't think it works at all. I think it comes from people, frankly, don't understand the realities of international trade, and a lot of it is just about buzzwords and rhetoric. That's not to say it can't do some good for specific cities that get it. there's trade-off is there, although in the longer run, we might have opinions about what paths were not taken or could still be taken for the UK. But yeah, it's a bit of a boost to what Plymouth is doing anyway. It's got more funding, got this infrastructure, it's got these increased incentives for business and boost for like more technological innovation involving universities and so on as well. Nice, that is a boost, and you can understand why the council went for it in that sense. There are some examples of local councils not necessarily playing the government's game. For example, you will have noticed there are these new investment zones, and Oxford City Council was invited to apply for one, and they just said, no, we don't need this. We think it's nonsense, basically. They said that Oxford is incredibly prosperous, dynamic. They said, well, don't talk to us about innovation and so on. We find that Oxford can do that better. Sutherland or Plymouth can is a different. So there are the pros. Different types of cons. That's not fun. Volatility, obviously, in a different sense. One thing came out of that budget. It was obviously swamped by the absolutely crazy policies and all that's come since then. But come up with these new investment zones on top of these Freeports. Now, investment zones are different. They're not about the trade angle, but they offer similar tax and planning incentives, but they actually offer more than a Freeport does. And one of these, Plymouth will be one of these as well, and that's a question, I think, for people to work out how these will interact in practice. I'm not sure anyone knows, but frankly. But there's a sense here of the goalposts being moved, and if we think, and I think that, the major economic benefit is just to attract business through these tax incentives. There are now many more competitors. So there were 7 other Freeports, but there now be 37, 38 other places. Bristol or wherever, go, yeah, you can come here and do all these things with more incentives. So that's that is a bit of a problem, I would suggest. Now this is probably more of an insight into my caffeine-fueled brain than the average person would want. I don't know if you know the internet meme of the kind of mouse, which is some of the different risks and challenges of the question. Now, to be fair to the Freeport and people, this could be for anything, radical or intro. There are always risks and challenges, but I think there are quite a few. Start with political risks. As I said, it really struck me how most people in Plymouth, including in the media, talking about this report in ways as a typical kind of regional development, local development project. But there's more to it now. It's intimately linked with Brexit and with, for many people, slightly toxic government. And this can be reflected in different ways. This is, I think, reflected in public opinion. I haven't seen polls on the Freeport. That's another thing that should be done actually. But you get in these people's fears that this chartered cities, which will have no labour rights or something like that, this kind of dystopian future. And you can understand why they might think that, because they've been told so many lies or half-truths about other things in recent years. More specifically, although it seems less likely now, Trump seems to have decided maybe not to have a trade war with the European Union, as well as taking on the IMF financial markets from the Bank of England. So, but again, it could be an issue. Would the EU say, well, we'll just hit these reports you're so fond of? That's again, you could see that it could get mixed up. Now, I don't think that's that likely. Actually, I don't think it's going to happen. But it's just a sense of how it does bring Plymouth into a slightly different political place than the levelling up fund or the city deal or whatever. So the major kind of risk or challenge is, I think if we assume, and I think it's the mind that gets some of this investment, can this really be used to help, improve socioeconomic equality, or will it just continue what we've seen, which is, Royal Building Yard, very cool, luxury flats, but who can afford to live there, from the surrounding area and so on. And some great innovations going on, but of course it's not necessarily they're not necessarily employing that many local people and so on. In doing so, could they increase local alienation? Because the other point to note about these free ports and the custom sites is they do require security as well. There will be, barbed wire fences and electric fences and that kind of thing. There will be serious security. I'm not sure. I'm interested in people's opinion in Langford or Sherford. Would it make that much difference? I don't know, to the landscape or the local sense of place. I don't know if there's a problem there. And presumably South Yard, because of its naval connection, is kind of used to some of that anyway. So I don't know in Plymouth's case whether it makes that much of a difference, but that's generally a kind of concern about these zones, because they're free for products and money to accept, but not for people at all. They do impose themselves. There's a sense that Plymouth has laid out as a relatively enlightened ideas that this is not going to be a race to the bottom. We're not just going to kind of pinch some business from Cornwall or Exeter. But we know it's tough economic times coming, and will they hold to that? Will they really go, no, we're not taking your offer of a plant that will employ 200 people because we know you're only coming from Bristol? That will get tough. Likewise for their strict environmental standards, when as it was already happening, the economic pressure hits, will they keep to that, or will they just feel, we've got to use this? All of which then can relate to reputational risks and local alienation. And there's also the risk, although I think this might be fading actually, because I'm not sure how long it will last, but that they really do try something much more radical, which is what some of the Conservative Party wanted, of really having, you can ignore most environmental regulations and labour standards. That could be really kind of divisive for Plymouth and other areas and so on, create all kinds of tensions. So that's kind of outline some of these risks and challenges, but mostly some of these are things just to be discussed. As I said, they're present anyway. Some key questions that I still have from this, although I'm inclining towards no for the first two. Are there really trade sectors where the Freeport can be a real advantage? The sectors outlined by this council are marine, naval, and space. Now, these particularly marine and naval aren't normally what we call trade sectors. It's normally things like automotives, electronics, this type of pharmaceutical. So it's not clear even what products are exactly in that or not. But from the work done so far, it doesn't seem likely that there are very, very striking trade benefits in the sense of the US foreign trade zone, for example, whether they're good or bad, I don't know, but they do have genuine trade benefits and do get a lot of investment. Can the UK sort out this kind of lack of clarity and go to the EU or Canada or Japan or South Africa? Look, can you guarantee that stuff made in Plymouth, Freeport, wherever will get in tariff free? I think probably not. As I said, can they maintain the kind of high standards and aspirations of the Freeport, which is, you can read the material, and it's all very positive, and it's hard to argue with a lot of it. but can they? We all know that there's a difference between the reality and the ideal. Can this work in practice? And what role for the public in this? Councils do have oversight on this, but you know, it's the table is laid though to a large extent. How will we know it is working? That's the thing. I suppose there are various targets about investment and so on, but interesting look at what's the impact on other businesses that aren't in these favoured sectors, other regions, local regions that aren't and don't have tax and customs tax. So how will we know it's working? And of course, if there is a new government, say a Labour-led coalition, you know, will they maintain this policy or quietly marginalise it? I don't think, because most of the Freeports are in areas that Labour either are present or would want to win, like England, it's politically competitive very much as a city. So I don't think they would dump the policy after all that's gone on, but it mightn't exactly be a priority as well either. So as I said, my working conclusion is, as a trade policy, not really at the races, could still be a benefit to Plymouth, but there's very many things to look out for. And on that